both is the supreme end and is universally admitted to be so. He seems to assume throughout that we must mean by good conduct what is productive of pleasure, and by bad what is productive of pain. So far then, as he is a hedonist, he would seem to be a naturalistic hedonist. So much for Mr. Spencer. It is of course quite possible that his treatment of ethics contained many interesting and instructive remarks. It would seem, indeed, that Mr. Spencer's main view, that of which he is most clearly and most often conscious, is that pleasure is the sole good, and that to consider the direction of evolution is by far the best criterion of the way in which we shall get most of it, and this theory, if he could establish that amount of pleasure is always in direct proportion to amount of evolution, and also that it was plain what conduct was more evolved, would be a very valuable contribution to the science of sociology. It would even, if pleasure were the sole good, be a valuable contribution to ethics. But the above discussion should have made it plain that if what we want from an ethical philosopher is a scientific and systematic ethics, not merely an ethics professedly based on science, if what we want is a clear discussion of the fundamental principles of ethics, and a statement of the ultimate reason why one way of acting should be considered better than another, then Mr. Spencer's Data of Ethics is immeasurably far from satisfying these demands. 34. It remains only to state clearly what is definitely fallacious in prevalent views as to the relation of evolution to ethics, in those views with regard to which it seems so uncertain how far Mr. Spencer intends to encourage them. I propose to confine the term evolutionistic ethics to the view that we need only to consider the tendency of evolution in order to discover the direction in which we ought to do. This view must be carefully distinguished from certain others, which may be commonly confused with it. 1. It might, for instance, be held that the direction in which living things have hitherto developed is, as a matter of fact, the direction of progress. It might be held that the more evolved is, as a matter of fact, also better. And in such a view no fallacy is involved. But, if it is to give us any guidance as to how we ought to act in the future, it does involve a long and painful investigation of the exact points in which the superiority of the more evolved consists. We cannot assume that, because evolution is progress on the whole, therefore every point in which the more evolved differs from the less is a point in which it is better than the less. A simple consideration of the course of evolution will therefore, on this view, by no means suffice to inform us of the course we ought to pursue. We shall have to employ all the resources of a strictly ethical discussion in order to arrive at a correct valuation of the different results of evolution, to distinguish the more valuable from the less valuable, and both from those which are no better than their causes, or perhaps even worse. In fact, it is difficult to see how, on this view, if all that be meant is that evolution has on the whole been a progress, the theory of evolution can give any assistance to ethics at all. The judgment that evolution has been a progress is itself an independent ethical judgment, and even if we take it to be more certain and obvious than any of the detailed judgment upon which it must logically depend for confirmation, we certainly cannot use it as a datum from which to infer details. It is at all events certain that, if this had been the only relation held to exist between evolution and ethics, no such importance would have been attached to the bearing of evolution on ethics as we actually find claimed for it. 2. The view which, as I have said, seems to be Mr. Spencer's main view, may also be held without fallacy. It may be held that the more evolved, though not itself the better, is a criterion, because a concomitant of the better. But this view also obviously involves an exhaustive preliminary discussion of the fundamental ethical question, what, after all, is better. That Mr. Spencer entirely dispenses with such a discussion in support of his contention that pleasure is the sole good, I have pointed out, and that, if we attempt such a discussion, we shall arrive at no such simple result, I shall presently try to shew. If, however, the good is not simple, it is by no means likely that we shall be able to discover evolution to be a criterion of it. we shall have to establish a relation between two highly complicated sets of data, and, moreover, if we had once settled what were goods and what their comparative values, it is extremely unlikely that we should need to call in the aid of evolution as a criterion of how to get the most. It is plain then, again, that if this were the only relation imagined to exist between evolution and ethics, it could hardly have been thought to justify the assignment of any importance in ethics to the theory of evolution. Finally, 3. It may be held that, though evolution gives us no help in discovering what results of our efforts will be best, it does give some help in discovering what it is possible to attain and what are the means to its attainment. That the theory really may be of service to ethics in this way cannot be denied. But it is certainly not common to find this humble ancillary bearing clearly and exclusively assigned to it. In the mere fact, then, that these non-fallacious views of the relation of evolution to ethics would give so very little importance to that relation, we have evidence that what is typical in the coupling of the two names is the fallacious view to which I propose to restrict the name evolutionistic ethics. This is the view that we ought to move in the direction of evolution simply because it is the direction of evolution. That the forces of nature are working on that side is taking as a presumption that it is the right side. That such a view, apart from metaphysical presuppositions, with which I shall presently deal, is simply fallacious, I have tried to shew. It can only rest on a confused belief that somehow the good simply means the side on which nature is working. And it thus involves another confused belief which is very marked in Mr. Spencer's whole treatment of evolution. For, after all, is evolution the side on which nature is working? In the sense which Mr. Spencer gives to the term, and in any sense in which it can be regarded as a fact that the more evolved is higher, evolution denotes only a temporary historical process. That things will permanently continue to evolve in the future, or that they have always evolved in the past, we have not the smallest reason to believe. For evolution does not, in this sense, denote a natural law, like the law of gravity. Darwin's theory of natural selection does indeed state a natural law. It states that, given certain conditions, certain results will always happen. But evolution, as Mr. Spencer understands it, and as it is commonly understood, denotes something very different. It denotes only a process which has actually occurred at a given time, because the conditions at the beginning of that time happen to be of a certain nature. That such conditions will always be given, or have always been given, cannot be assumed, and it is only the process which, according to natural law, must follow from these conditions and no others, that appears to be also on the whole a progress. Precisely the same natural laws, Darwin's for instance, would under other conditions render inevitable not evolution, not a development from lower to higher, but the converse process, which has been called involution. Yet Mr. Spencer constantly speaks of the process which is exemplified by the development of man as if it had all the augustness of a universal law of nature, whereas we have no reason to believe it other than a contemporary accident requiring not only certain universal natural laws, but also the existence of a certain state of things at a certain time. The only laws concerned in the matter are certainly such as, under other circumstances, would allow us to infer not the development but the extinction of man. And that circumstances will always be favorable to further development, that nature will always work on the side of evolution, we have no reason whatever to believe. Thus the idea that evolution throws important light on ethics seems to be due to a double confusion. Our respect for the process is enlisted by the representation of it as the law of nature. But on the other hand, our respect for laws of nature would be speedily diminished did we not imagine that this desirable process was one of them. To suppose that a law of nature is therefore respectable is to commit the naturalistic fallacy. But no one, probably, would be tempted to commit it, unless something which is respectable were represented as a law of nature. If it were clearly recognized that there is no evidence for supposing nature to be on the side of the good, there would probably be less tendency to hold the opinion, which on other grounds is demonstrably false, that no such evidence is required. And if both false opinions were clearly seen to be false, it would be plain that evolution has very little indeed to say to ethics. 35. In this chapter I have begun the criticism of certain ethical views, which seem to owe their influence mainly to the naturalistic fallacy, the fallacy which consists in identifying the simple notion which we mean by good with some other notion. They are views which profess to tell us what is good in itself, and my criticism of them is mainly directed, 1. To bring out the negative result, that we have no reason to suppose that which they declare to be the sole good really to be so; 2. To illustrate further the positive result, already established in chapter 1, that the fundamental principle of ethics must be synthetic propositions, declaring what things, and in what degree, possess a simple and unanalyzable property which may be called intrinsic value or goodness. The chapter began, 1. By dividing the views to be criticized into a. Those which, supposing good to be defined by reference to some supersensible reality, conclude that sole good is to be found in such a reality, and may therefore be called metaphysical. b. Those which assign a similar position to some natural object, and may therefore be called naturalistic. Of naturalistic views, that which regards pleasure as the sole good has received far the fullest and most serious treatment, and was therefore reserved for chapter 3. All other forms of naturalism may be first dismissed by taking typical examples. 2. As typical of naturalistic views, other than hedonism, there was first taken the popular accommodation of what is natural. It was pointed out that by natural there might here be meant either normal or necessary, and that neither normal nor the necessary could be seriously supposed to be either always good or the only good things. 3. But a more important type, because on which claims to be capable of system, is to be found in evolutionistic ethics. The influence of the fallacious opinion that to be better means to be more evolved was illustrated by an examination of Mr. Herbert Spencer's ethics, and it was pointed out that, but for the influence of this opinion, evolution could hardly have been supposed to have any important bearing on ethics. End of chapter 2.